All right, so I want to show you an example of a pretty straightforward program flowchart. First, to think about the steps required and also to reemphasize the syntax, the proper spelling, what these symbols mean, etc. Okay, so this is a simple program that's going to take an amount that, say, the user owns, maybe it's a bank customer, calculate some interest and figure out what their monthly payment would be. So let's take this step by step. First, I want to kind of talk about the logic, and then we'll drill back into the syntax, which is important too. So whenever you're doing these flow charts, you have to juggle both things. You have to understand exactly the syntax, but also the logic of what you're doing. So let's look at the logic first. So we're going to read in the amount that they owe. Next step, we're going to calculate some interest. Next step, we're going to add that back to the total because before we calculate the monthly payment, we want to know the amount plus the interest. Then we divide it by 12. Then we output it back out. So that's kind of the logic of what this program is doing. Getting something, doing some calculations, outputting something else. But let's look at it from top to bottom because every symbol here has to be exactly correct. Every word has to be spelled properly, etc. So every program is going to start with this termination symbol that's going to have the capital start in it. So every flowchart you do, just do the termination symbol and put that capitalized start in there. Typically, the next thing you're going to do is get something from the user, which is a read statement. But notice between those symbols, there should be an arrow, not just a line, but an arrow. So the arrow in a flowchart just shows somebody who's reading this what the flow of the program is going to be. So sometimes these flowcharts can get complex and go off on branches, so the arrows let the user see where it's going. So don't just put a line here, but put an arrow between that and the next symbol. Next, we need to get something from the user. So we're going to use that input-output symbol. And since we're reading it in, we're getting it, we want to do keyword read. And that kind of brings us to this next concept, which is a variable. So in programming, a variable is just something to store something in. It's just a storage place or a container. So let's say the amount the user owes is $500. We'll read that in and it'll get stored in this variable that we call amount owed. Okay, so after your keyword read, typically there's going to be a variable name or multiple variable names. Let's stick with this example though. So we've got one variable called amount owed. So if they type $400, it will now be stored in this variable called amount owed. The only thing I'll say about the variables is typically you don't want spaces or numbers or symbols. So notice I've got amount owed all together, no spaces or anything. So that's important. Notice down here I have monthly payment. Don't put a space in there in a variable name. Again, so the next we want to start doing some steps to calculate things. So again, we have an arrow. Don't forget your arrows between every symbol in your flowchart. Now these are internal processes, right? We're not getting anything from the user, we're not outputting anything, we're just doing some processing. So first thing we're doing here is calculating some interest. So the way you designate that in flowcharting is you would have whatever you're trying to calculate equal to a bunch of stuff on the right side of the equals. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get interest. So we say interest equals whatever this calculation is here. So in this example, Our first variable is called amount owed. Now we have another variable called interest. So what we're doing is we're taking amount owed, so maybe that's $400. We're multiplying it by an interest rate, and we're setting that into this interest variable. So if it was $100, maybe the interest would be $590 or something, and that's what would be in this interest variable. So amount owed times something equals setting it into the interest variable. So now we got amount owed and the interest, but we don't have them together. So that's what this next process is going to do. We're taking the amount owed variable, which the user put in, adding it to that interest variable, which we just calculated, and we're setting that into another variable called total. Pretty straightforward there. Next step is also fairly straightforward. So we've got another process. So we got an arrow and then another rectangle. This is another internal process. We're taking that total that we just arrived at, which was the amount plus the interest, dividing it by 12, and setting that into this monthly payment variable. So we've got amount owed variable, interest variable, total variable, and now one more variable called monthly payment, which is just the total divided by 12. That value gets stored into this variable. That's what we'll output with our output statement. So when we're ready to do output, remember we got to go back to the input-output symbol. When we're getting input, it's a read. When we're doing output, it's a write. So write followed by a variable name or a message or several variable names. In this case, we're just writing out the monthly payment amount, whatever that might be that's in this monthly payment variable. Now, like I mentioned, beginners often just put lines instead of arrows. That's one beginner mistake, so make sure you have arrows. The other one is often we forget to put the stop at the bottom because we're focused on our problem solving, our logic, our syntax. Don't forget once you're done, one more arrow and the termination symbol, which is the stop. One other thing I want to reemphasize that I talked about in the other video, all these keywords are in all caps, right? Start, read, write, stop. Variable names don't necessarily have to be. So you could have an all caps amount owed if you want, but notice I have kind of a mixed case because it's not a keyword like start or read. So that's why my variables aren't necessarily in all caps.